So thanks everybody for coming out and checking out this fancy little shindig we're putting on here. This is our Purple Teaming in OT webinar. So for those of you that didn't attend the previous one, this is a part 2 to the prerequisite that was Purple Teaming 101 that we did last month. We're going to kind of cover the basics here. We'll do a quick overview again as a refresher of what Purple Teaming is, some of the basic steps like gathering threat intelligence, putting it together in emulation strategies, stuff like that. But we're going to talk to everything from a ICS and OT perspective, so operational technology, thinking about industrial control systems, the way their environments are set up, and how we can take this process that we're calling purple teaming and apply it to that realm. So with that in mind, here is the obligatory Who Am I slide. I am Trey. I am the lead adversary emulation engineer over here at Scythe. You might be asking yourself, why is this guy in front of me and not Bryson? Well, the thing is this is something I took over for him with the way he was doing his workshops. And, as a CEO, you're always on call on business. He was actually giving one in tandem. So I'm going to be heading these ones up. But my background's really varied, 15 plus years in IT, security, red teaming, blue team, whatever you want to talk about. I've got a bunch of alphabet soup up on the screen. If you want to find out more or just check in with me, give me a follow. You can find me at tcraft on Twitter, or there's my LinkedIn as well. So I want to start this off with a quick little scenario, a story for you, and we're going to call this a tragedy played out live. Like, nice little reference here to Romeo and Juliet. Gotta love what you can do with AI nowadays. So Act 1, meet Joe Sizzo, our fancy looking unicorn here in a snappy suit. He is the head CISO for a big mining conglomerate. They do a lot of work globally. But here lately, over the last year or so, the Americas region and their facilities have had several different attacks that have happened or breaches. The first one being a physical breach of their electrical fence around one of their compounds for their mining sites. The second one being threat actors successfully tricking one of their major partners that they have business dealings with into a business email compromise. And long story short, a bunch of other stuff happened here that also ended up in a network intrusion happening for our mining conglomerate that led to a threat actor being able to successfully get into IoT devices, things like the print server in the environment, not just normal IT host and solutions. With all this in mind, he's going, you know what, we really need to think about this. We need to make some changes. So we're going to conduct this really big, rigorous endeavor to physically and logically separate our IT and OT networks across all of our sites in North America. This costs the organization hundreds of millions of dollars, and each site has an excess of that in equipment that is maintaining their operations, that is maintaining quality of life for their workers while they're down in the mines or while they're working in the processing plants and stuff. And any kind of real disruption to these sites could cause loss of life. So they really want to make sure that they're putting in the correct defenses, they're overhauling the whole area and making sure things work right. So with that in mind, they designed this really cool new setup. They deploy it and validate that it works and everything turns out good, right? Well, that's what we would hope would happen. Well, while Joe Sizzo here is out inspecting one of his new sites, he sees this fancy little truck, like you guys can see here on the screen, with a vendor in it, just drive onto the site and start driving down into one of the compounds in the area. With this in mind, he sees him hop out of his truck, kind of follows to see what he's doing, and grab a laptop and just walk on in. It's kind of at this moment that Joe Sizzo knows they messed up. As an intermission, this environment, this OT environment, the mine, the place that are doing all of this work, the whole process is happening. It's supposed to be a physically isolated network, right? It's holding up tons and tons of earth. It's ensuring the air quality for the workers down underground. It's doing a bunch of different things. But this vendor was able to just kind of stroll on in. So what's up with that? There's already one glaring red flag to their whole new overhaul, right? Well, it turns out this vendor is there on a mission. He walks in, finds the piece of equipment he's looking for, and just plugs in his laptop. And as an organization, Joe Sizzo's group now has no control over said laptop. The security posture it has, is the software on it updated? What's going on? What's he doing? Is he pushing new instruction sets to our equipment? We don't know. So this whole rigmarole that we went through, this whole big change, upgrading everything, the time, the effort, the money that was spent in making these security and physical changes was all negated by one contractor and a little laptop that he's probably used at every other customer he's been at that week. Are we starting to see the kind of the problem here when you think about this from an OT space and physical separation? Where I'm using this story as kind of a jump point to say, if we were all working together, if we were being collaborative, thinking of this from a purple perspective, not just, well, we need to put defenses in place, so let's build defenses. If everyone was consulted, we would be able to predict and foresee these kind of actions. We would be able to take into account day-to-day operations if we bring the OT practitioners in, not just our IT security team. So we want to ensure that we're getting the point across here and we're collaborating. At the end of the day, if you take nothing else from this, this should always be collaborative. But with that in mind, nice little story to kind of get us where we need to go with some fancy artwork. Let's get into the meat and the potatoes of this, right? We wanted to talk purple teaming. So what is purple teaming? I'm sure you guys have heard it before. I've said it once or twice, and I'm sure you've heard our previous leaders say the whole little joke of, well, we all went to elementary school, right? We all learned Roy G. Biv. We learned how colors mix together. Red plus blue equals purple. From a simplistic sense, that's really what it is, right? We're taking our red team, we're taking our blue team, and we're saying, hey, work together. You guys do a thing. But from a broader perspective, what this really is collaborative and milestone-driven exercises. So these aren't just including your red team and your blue team. These should include the executive suite, ops, anyone that has a stake in your business operations, especially if it includes IT operations within it, should be in the mix. These can take shape in things like tabletop exercises, incident response scenarios, true purple team engagements where you're running actions on virtual host or actually causing physical impact. I'm going to use that term in air quotes. But doing these kind of things together, all of that can be considered a purple team exercise if done collaboratively and done right. We want to explicitly define our success criteria so that we have milestones to reach. This exercise isn't the traditional like kind of pen test style where you just think about throwing everything at the book. It's we are afraid of this specific thing happening. We want to test this hypothesis and see what happens. That's what we're trying to do here. Now, for those of you that attended before, these next 2 or 3 slides are basically just a rehash from part 1. I assume there's going to be a few people that hopped in and didn't see that yet. So quick little slide on testing maturity when we think about red teaming, purple teaming, all of this kind of together and what we're talking about. We're going to put some definitions here in place. To the far left, we start thinking of vulnerability scanning, assessments, penetration testing. In this instance, I'm talking about penetration testing as in like unauthorized access to a system or an application. I'm talking the whole little process where everything is looked at in a silo and you're validating and assuming potential risk based on that issue in a vacuum. A lot of this is compliance-based. It's going to be there for vulnerability management. It's going to make sure that you're meeting regulations and the compliances and standards you're supposed to. As we start venturing further right, we start getting towards red teaming and adversary emulation. This is where we're starting to get into really complex, really security-focused testings and engagements. These are going to be very much threat-based. It's going to be what can the team do? It's no longer a simple penetration test. We're taking into account the physical, the logical, everything, the holistic view. What can we do as a threat to assess your organization? When we think about purple teaming, we feel like it sits right there in that nice middle spot. You have the ability to do a lot of the stuff we see on the left, but our focus is more on what do we as an organization see as a threat to us. We try to emulate it, and we also try to validate that we are able to detect, alert, log, and respond to all of these issues. So when we think about testing maturity, defining what these tests are for us in the sake of purple teaming, that's really where we're kind of going with this. So exercise flow with purple teaming, there's a lot of people that are going to be involved. The tests themselves can be super simple, but for this to be a true collaborative effort, you've got to get the organization on board, right? You're going to need leadership. You're going to need your blue team, your red team, your detection engineers, anyone and everyone that has a stake. But some of the key markers and key important people and roles you'll have during these exercises is going to be your exercise coordinator. Think of this as the green cell. This is that leadership piece that's coordinating everything, herding all of the cats, and presenting, okay, look, this is our topics. These are what we're doing. These are what we plan to show. And here's the plan of action throughout the event. You have your red team that's going to come in. They're the ones that are going to be emulating the threat that you guys have perceived, that you've prepared. They're going to do this in a manner that everyone can see what they're doing and we're being transparent. You don't want to just like, haha, I ran a few actions and we got you, and then walk away. We're very much doing this all in tandem. They'll come in, do those threats, while the blue team is using their processes and procedures to determine if there was any kind of detections that tripped, if there was an alert. Can they see and respond to what the red team just did? If they can, cool, you can mark those things as successes. If there's a gap that you found, however, that's when you start bringing in the rest of that team, your detection engineers and these other people, to on real time make adjustments to your security posture, to the way you guys alert and detect certain things and the security controls that you have in place. You want to ensure you can increase your visibility. The whole point here is to shore up defenses and improve your overall security posture. So we want to make sure that we're actively taking those steps, not just waiting for a report 30 to 60 days from now. And then for everyone else involved, really what we have going on here is you're involved in the tabletop discussion of the security controls, what our expectations are for each specific behavior we're running, as well as helping to repeat the procedures, record the new results, and continuously move and iterate through this process. All this tracking to make sense so far? See, I know a lot of you guys can't talk, but there's some thumbs up or something in chat. That way I know you guys are good in tracking. Thank you, Eric. All right, moving on. So we've talked about our nice little scenario. We kind of got a picture of some of the problems we could see within OT systems and merging with IT. We talked about what purple teaming is, kind of the exercise flow, what's involved. So let's flip the script for a second and let's think about ICS. When we're using that term, what are we talking about? What is ICS? Just drop some examples or what your thoughts are down there in chat real quick. I'll see what you guys think. And I asked some kind of follow-on questions and things to lead this thought process here. What's really the difference between like a laptop or an embedded device? Something you would see, say, working on this little picture right now. A nuclear reactor, yeah, that's a very extreme example, yeah. The things that control the physical world, that's a great way of saying that. Something that's controlling something else. Yeah, we could say that. The easiest and the simplistic way to say this, or the way we could think about it, is it's any computer that's at least 20 years old. Anything you got that's still running Windows XP, we can consider that an embedded system, or ICS OT. Now, all jokes aside, yes, Grayson is exactly right. Anything that's industrial, those control systems that work in manufacturing, power, water, gas, stuff that has very large, very scalable processes, but also very dangerous processes to yourself, the plant, and the potential area around you. But what we're thinking about here are these embedded devices that are running our processes for us, like a lot of the ones that Grayson mentioned in chat. They're typically very long-lived systems. Their life cycle is on a pattern of 20 to 30, or beyond years, not 2 to 3 years for a typical like IT tech refresh. These systems are made and purpose-built to be very minimal maintenance, if at all. They're meant to be always available, so high availability is really a concern when we think about them. And they typically cost a lot more money because of what they're doing, the ephemeral protocols they're dealing with, the processes they're running. They're not just a standard Dell little laptop or a NUC or something. They're purpose-built equipment with these long lifespans. But they also have one critical issue. With these long life cycles, when you're starting to think about buying equipment that cost in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars for a plant or a process, not just singular thousands of dollars or less, is they're going to get out of date. Their cost is almost prohibitive to replace them. Sometimes they're unique devices, they're one of ones, and you can't just hot swap them. This also brings in issues with these closed environments and the way they run and the high availability that you're unable to apply and implement patching or updates to the operating systems that are on that upper layer controlling the device itself. So it brings some unique scenarios and issues to OT that we don't typically see in traditional IT, right? So keep this in mind as we're going through this whole process, as we're thinking about testing and OT and purple teaming and the way you would build threats. So a little more background here. What is OT? We're thinking about this. So we've all seen like the TCP/IP model, the traditional way that we draw network diagrams, things like that, right? Keep those pictures in your head of the way we think about it from traditional IT. One of the standard ways that we're looking at this from an OT perspective is the Purdue model, and it's being broken down into 5 different levels. So 0 through 4, 0 always counts for something in our world, right? So 5 levels, and traditionally that level 4, that top level is your enterprise IT. This is all of the traditional information systems that you see in any business organization. So your employee workstations, file servers, email, data centers, cloud access, all of that fun stuff, all of the typical things that you need to make a business run. Level 3, 3 and 2.5, 3.5, we can consider this our beachhead, right? Our DMZ. This is how we're controlling access in and out between our business IT environment and our actual OT components and environment. So that level 3, that's going to be your boundary. It's going to have anything like your firewalls, one-way write switches, your historians that are recording information from the lower levels, any of these kind of sensors or security implementations that we need to ensure proper segmentation of the systems and the plants themselves. At level 2, 2.5 here, this spot is getting a little funky. We're starting to get into a position where traditional IT and modern, and I say modern, I mean normal, often outdated OT merge. So you've got things that are sitting in here like the engineering workstations that are handling any of the like the configuration files, the instruction sets, all of those things are being stored and hosted here. This is where your actual like OT professionals, your workers are handling and doing their work throughout the day. You've got things like HMIs or discrete control systems, all of these other OT specific things that are sitting in this niche that are able to talk, control, and understand what's happening in the physical process itself. As you start getting down into level 1 and level 0, this is where really the magic's happening, right? Level 1 is taking those instruction sets and everything it's getting from level 2 and putting that into a format that it can actually make level 0, the physical process itself, do a thing. So say taking instruction sets from that HMI or from the logic we provided it and making the robot arm, like you can see on the screen, move around and do a specific thing within the process. So there's a lot more to this, right? It's a lot more complicated than traditional IT when we just think layer 2 and layer 3, stuff switched or it's routed. We do network segmentation, all of that kind of fun stuff, right? This is kind of that on steroids. There's a lot more to it. There's a lot more to take into account because a lot of these information systems at that level 2 and lower may not necessarily understand or be able to talk basic TCP/IP protocol stack, depending on the age. Some of the newer stuff has the ability now when you think about things like Modbus over TCP, but it's very much a newer thing. Some of these systems, these life cycles that they have that have been put in place aren't getting that upgrade yet, and they might not for another 5 or 10 years. So we have to be wary of that, pay attention to it, and understand that those OT components are very much in a state that we don't want to directly affect. Affecting them can cause loss of revenue. It can cause loss of the ability to continue generating and doing those business operations. But also there's the potential of safety issues, right? Loss of life. Something goes wrong, somebody gets hurt, it turns into a big deal. Yeah, here's a quick little model to explain how it's looked at and how it's thought of from a segmentation level in OT. So testing, this is what we're really here for, right? We got an understanding now of what we mean by talking purple and how that works traditional IT. We have an idea of what we consider ICS or operational technology and how that traditionally looks in a business process environment. Now let's talk about actually getting down to doing the purple teaming. Three main things we talked about in the prior class that we typically control when it comes to testing. You've got scope, what we're doing, where we're doing it, and the rules we have to play by. You've got frequency, so how often are we doing this? Weekly, monthly, quarterly, whatever works for your organization. And then we have complexity. When it comes to complexity, we start dealing with issues of, do we want realism or convenience? And depending on your organization's skill level and what you're trying to do, you can go for convenient. You have things like atomic red team or taking static behaviors and just running them through PowerShell, things like that. It's super convenient, but it's not complex. It's not showing a full kill chain, and it's not directly emulating what you would see from a threat. So for that convenience, you're sacrificing a bit of realism. But then you start getting into other things and you start thinking about building your own like payloads, automating threats and the emulations they're doing, executing full kill chains I've seen through proper actionable CTI and places like that. Now you're getting very complex, but you're starting to peak that realism scale more. You're actually doing an emulation that's matching what's being seen. So this is the traditional cycle, or the trinity, you can say, of what we're controlling and testing. Now, this is going to vary a bit when we start thinking about it from an OT perspective. And what it comes down to is mission number one for us as testers or organizers or whatever your potential role might be within this whole process is building trust. For operational technology, they don't work the same way we do in traditional IT environments. They don't have a security team and your IT sysadmins and everyone, and they just do stuff and let people do whatever they feel like doing within them. No, they've got their very small circle of trust because availability is key, safety is key, and they don't know you, they don't trust you. They're not just going to let you come in and start poking and prodding at their process and what's going on. We've got to establish that trust with them. And we want to ensure that as we're doing these tests and as we're gaining and building and establishing that trust, that we cannot break things. We can ensure safety is paramount and show that within our capabilities. Once we can build that trust, then we can start actually doing the thing. So let's look at this at trust through testing and what we can control here. With scope, now this is completely out of your hands. That OT team is going to control that scope. It is up to them what they are going to say is safe to test against, if anything, in production. The frequency, this is still something you as an organization collaboratively, sorry about that, can control. So it's not that big of a change. With complexity, however, we don't want to bring in our first purple team engagement and try and do an entire full kill chain of a threat from initial execution to lateral movement and prevesc and persistence and actually cause impact. We want to show these operational technology professionals, show these guys that are actually ensuring that our processes continue, that we have tools and behaviors and TTPs, we've tested them, we validate this within a lab environment, which is the best case scenario, right? We want to show that we can make it work in a controlled environment first before we even ever try to do anything in a production environment. And we're doing this in a transparent manner, just like we were talking about with the purple team engagement as a whole. We want everyone to see what's involved. How were the TTPs developed and ran, not just a thing happened. Now let's see if we can find it. Does this make sense? All good here? So the biggest thing here is in establishing that trust, you as the IT part of this team, you're going to give up a bit of that typical control you usually have and allow the operational technology professionals to actually have that bit of control and ensure that safety and everything is adhered to. So Bryson's attack model, bam. If you haven't seen this before, this is something our fearless leader had come up with. Everyone gets really stuck on the thought of like full kill chains and all of these different acronyms and models you have to explain breach scenarios. We brought it back and went by the methodology of keep it simple. So you've got three main phases, right? You've got recon phase, the breach phase or initial access, and then actual actions on effects. As you move from left to right, especially for those of you that are prior military, the whole left of bang, right of bang kind of concept and thought process, the further right you move, the more actual impact there is to your organization. So from a purple perspective, from a threat perspective and things that we can control, things that we can develop detections and things and protections around, The left side of this model, the reconnaissance phase, all of this stuff, the weaponization, building out their infrastructure as a threat, we can't control, right? A great example of this would be, say somebody wants to break into your house and steal your fancy new TV or toy or whatever it is that you got. The recon side, this is a good analogy here would be, say there's just someone walking down the street casing your house. They're taking a look at it, seeing what your doors and windows look like, what time of day people are home, what kind of security implementations you have in place. You can't really do anything about that. And there's also, we take into account everything that we publish on the internet, everything that's put out as public record, your tax records, who bought the house and when, any kind of legal things, taxes that were filed, all of this. It's information that people can easily reach out and see, and we can't control. It's out of our hands. So it's not something we can truly be concerned with. Of course, we want to put out as minimal of a footprint as possible, but data is going to get out. If you're doing business, there's nothing you can really do about it, because you're going to have to do the filings with the states you're incorporated in. You're going to have to file taxes, information to your investors and boards, and all of your social media and your marketing and efforts, stuff gets out. So that's kind of out of our hands. As we start moving towards the right, that initial access and breach phase, here's where it starts kind of getting into our realm, but we kind of overthink it, overwork it. From that initial access perspective, let's look at this as a simple example. The robber now, instead of casing your house, has decided to take some action. He walks up, picks the lock, does something fancy, jimmies a window, and opens it. Consider this like gaining shell on a host. Now they've breached your systems, they've gained access, they've gotten a shell, or they've gotten access to the internal portion of your house. But they haven't done anything really yet. We get so caught up on this whole concept of keep that robber out, keep the breach out, stop everything at the boundary. We build 10-foot walls, not thinking that a bird's going to fly over the wall, right? It doesn't matter how big of a wall you create. Something is eventually going to get over it. With that in mind, from an IT perspective, it's not a matter of if you get breached. It's no longer the case. It's a matter of when. It's going to happen. It may not be this week. It may not be this year. You're going to get breached. That's just the way of the world nowadays. And we see it in the news constantly. Everyone's got their own intel feeds and news reports they follow. There's a new one, sometimes 4 or 5 a day from large organizations. And that's just the stuff we're seeing. That's not accounting for the little small organizations that aren't newsworthy from a media sensationalization perspective. We can do our due diligence, put external boundary controls and defensive measures in place. But when we're thinking purple teaming and we're starting to think about what we can truly control, this is that actions on effects phase of this model. This is where we start seeing true organizational impact. If someone's coming in and trying to do ransomware or steal intellectual property, now they have to actually do something in your environment, right? They're not just kind of hanging out passively looking. They've got to interact with data. They've got to interact with hosts, with users. All of these things are going to generate noise. It's going to create logs. It's going to make someone question something. Something will happen. So with that in mind, we can build detections. We can build alerts and put defenses in place to let us know when something happens. And for us, this is especially important now because of a lot of these new regulations and things we're seeing put in place, where now time to report, the telemetry you're collecting, all of this stuff matters to government agencies and controlling bodies. They want to know, how long did they sit? How long have they dwelled? What's going on? Do you know? Do you have visibility over your environment and what happened? So we really have to start thinking about this perspective. If we can shore up our internal defenses, if we can ensure we have proper processes and procedures in place to detect, alert, and respond to threats, we can really improve our security posture. And it's going to do way more for us than building a bigger wall or adding a new boundary gateway device. Does that make sense? So when we think about purple teaming and we think about what we can control, what we can test against, and what we can show actions on objectives within these engagements, we're thinking post-breach, so post-compromise. And that's what we're going to look at through the rest of this. So how does this apply to OT? How do we, yes, better detection queries. Correct, Edward? So how do we apply this to to our adversary emulation effects in OT. Let's start thinking about this from a planning perspective. When it comes to OT environments, a lot of the setup, the way you build, the way you do things when it comes to making a threat, developing proper behaviors you want to emulate, is the exact same as in the IT environment. The difference here is when we think about a traditional pen test or a red team engagement or just purple team in enterprise IT, we take behaviors, we take things that are typically actionable, we run them to validate and test theories of how our detections are going to work. We actually cause some form of impact, whether that's simulating ransomware, that's data exfiltration, that's interacting with host, typing in commands, making changes, password spraying, anything you could really think of that would affect the host. We cause those kind of impacts from that level. In OT, this is not really the way we want to do things. And it's not the safe way to do things, right? Remember, safety is the key, is the reality of what we're trying to do here. So we can build up our emulation plans, and a lot, especially today, nowadays, a lot of the threats that we're seeing and focusing, the initial vector is going to be from some kind of IT vector. And these threats are typically already OT focused. They're not just hitting you and then trying to figure out how to interact with your devices. Odds are they already know what they're going for. They know how those devices work. They know the protocols, how to do the instructions. So it's a very quick kind of movement. We can show impact and show that that potential threat that you're trying to emulate is viable in an OT environment just based off gaining access. So if we can get into enterprise IT and move from that through your beachhead, through your boundary, and say be able to interact or access something like an HMI or the engineering workstation where those instruction sets are, where the ability to control and provide instructions is, now it's viable. We've proven that it's possible, right? So we always want to think about what our kind of impact is going to be versus, do I actually need to cause impact? Can I show impact by just gaining access? And 9 times out of 10, when we start thinking about this from an ICS and OT perspective, the ability to access something that's in that control in that layer, like level 2 area, we've already proven that yes, the threat is viable. There's an issue here that we need to correct and fill this gap. Now we're doing all of this in mind, taking the measurement of those protections we currently have in place, what kind of detections are working, what's not working, and not just our responses, but how long did it take us to respond? How long did it take us to get telemetry and visibility over this? And we have a nice little funnel when it comes to IT/OT environments in that beachhead, that layer 3 area, that is going to ensure, at a minimum, we're going to be able to have several detection opportunities within these environments. That's mainly focusing when we think about the discovery and the lateral movement phases of threats and breaches. And we'll get into that here in a little bit. So we're talking about planning. We're thinking about how we want to emulate that emerging threat or that threat actor. What kind of threat intelligence do we need? Where do we find it? How do we go about threat modeling? Let's dive into that a little bit. So this is the Pyramid of Pain. This has been around for well over a decade now, but this was made by David Bianco. It's a really cool breakdown. If you haven't read his blog before, talking about cyber threat intelligence, what's actionable, what's not, and how we can improve the way we handle and process CTI, the blog down here on the screen is amazing. The long story short of this is, as we're looking through this from low to high, hash values, IP addresses, domains, all those things that are very ephemeral that can change very easily, that's the kind of stuff that your tooling that's in place should already be thinking about and looking at. Your AV and EDR, all of your other security measures that do some kind of network intrusion detection or prevention, anything that's watching host logs, that's watching the executables you pull in, where data's talking, all of that, it's already being taken care of. So from a threat emulation and from a purple teaming perspective, this kind of stuff for us doesn't matter as much. And from a CTI process as a whole, having them is nice. It's cool. You can make a quick signature or alert from it. But what are the odds that the file you get in a breach that happens to you is the same as the same file that was seen breached in company X? It's not, right? Small minor changes. Now it's a completely different hash value. We can rename files. We can do all of this stuff that makes it different. The same thing can be said for threats, command and control infrastructure, the where and how they're doing these things, the domains they use, the IPs they come from, the net space, all of that is easily changeable. So it's not as big a focus for us, and those are the low-hanging fruit we can kind of ignore. As we start getting up into this pyramid a little higher, thinking about network and host level artifacts, some of these from a behavioral perspective can be helpful if we see things in tandem, like say a specific behavior that drops a file and the file does a thing. Those can be helpful, but they're still not the true north for us. Now, when we start getting into things like tools and TTPs and behaviors, is really where we should be focusing and thinking about for good actionable CTI when we're trying to develop and emulate these threats and perform our full purple team engagement. The tools, these are typically going to be things that they custom develop, things they bring along, whether that's their password crackers, that's some kind of say Bloodhound or a tool that gives them access or other capabilities not already on host. When we think TTPs and behaviors, these are the actual, like the commands, the actions, the things they're taking advantage of on that host. And here's where I would also include something like lolbins. So anything that's native built into the environment already that's there, regardless of what you do, the stuff they take advantage of there would fall up here in behaviors. Now, the reason our focus is here is because there's telemetry here. There's only so much they can do on a host to get the information they need or to make the changes and make their moves. So as long as we can understand that threat, we can emulate their behaviors, we can build alerts and detections in place against them. So to wrap all that back up, we really want to focus on solid TTPs, behaviors, and the tools that the threats we're trying to emulate are using. Now, if you didn't catch my spill before in the previous workshop and webinar, majority of these threats that you guys are seeing nowadays, these are all just divergence off of the original Conti playbook. If you look at their original playbook that got leaked and released compared to some of the new modern threats that we're seeing, once they get on host, everyone's doing the exact same thing. So understanding that from a singular threat perspective, like Conti, for example, is going to make us more able to build those good detection queries, those good alerts, and other security implementations and see it for other threats. So that's a boon for us. That's a good thing that they're starting to repeat the same behaviors. That makes it a little predictable. That makes it easier for us to do our job. So that's the types of CTI that we're looking at, we're thinking about. Now let's talk about finding it. I've included a couple slides here. If you've never done this whole process before, if you've never sourced your own CTI for an engagement or just in general, some of the ones that we personally, even here at Scythe Labs, myself and Tyler on the call here, use on a daily basis is the CISA alerts and advisories. They really just have been killing it lately with the stuff they're putting out into the world. There's so much content. I get 3-4 alerts from them daily about new stuff they put out there, and it's a great resource. They're very good about, when it's available, putting actionable CTI in there as well. So they'll give you examples of behaviors, how they're running commands, what they're taking advantage of, not just, we saw threat X doing this kind of thing, maybe. It's worthwhile, it's helpful, it's not just super vague. The DEFA report, Google's tag, they all put out great stuff as well. MITRE ATT&CK, we'll talk about that one here in a second. Unit 42, so Palo Alto's group. CrowdStrike, there's so many good people putting out great data now, it's almost too much to consume at times. So you kind of pare it down based on what you're looking for and who's providing you that kind of intelligence you need that matches your market. For us, for me and Tyler, one quick win that we have in the way that we kind of jump into this process a little faster is the start.me page made by InfoSec Ninja. In here, it pops up, think of it as kind of like a fancy dashboard in your web browser. And it's got RSS feeds basically for all of these big names that we're talking about in the threat intelligence realm. So like Microsoft, Unit 42, DFIR Report, Mandiant, anyone and everyone that's generating the kind of content that we need to do our jobs properly, it's in here in this dashboard. So it makes it really easy to kind of hop in, start seeing what's new, finding stuff that we need to build detections around, and in my case, things that we want to emulate. So these are just a few places you could go to find good CTI. Now, if you don't have a process in place and this is your first time kind of doing it, trying to build a threat emulation plan, let's look at the one and only MITRE ATT&CK, right? So MITRE ATT&CK here recently has got some really good information they put out. I'm sure you guys have all seen the attack framework. We've used it in some form or fashion in the defensive space for a while now. Their search functionality within the site provides us really easy ways to, yep, Chris was saying recorded feature is great. They definitely are. This search function within MITRE ATT&CK and in their page that they've got set up is really easy to find stuff that matches your industry, specific TTP tags. Maybe you're curious about a group, a name, a tool, something like that. They've indexed all of it very well that you can search on it and find the information you need. So like a good example here for defense industry based, if you're looking for groups or threat actors that specifically target you or potential old school, or not old school, but historical breaches that have happened in those spaces, a lot of that will populate here. The groups functionality and their other resources is a great place to start if you've never built threat campaigns. And here's a good example of this. As we're digging down through the MITRE ATT&CK groups, they've got pre-populated campaigns for you already. So when in doubt, if you don't have the time, capability, or know how to make your own, they have a bunch already for everything from criminal gangs, from ransomware actors, from state-sponsored stuff. They've put some really good reporting in place. They've included the behaviors. It's all tagged to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, so you can see it down to a TTP, a T code level. And you can take these and just wholesale create your threat and use that as a scenario. That's a great way to do it. And if we're thinking about this from an OT perspective, a lot of the really big historical threats that have been reported on and documented in here typically fall in that ICS OT realm, right? They're always something, they're like Florida water or the stuff that was happening in Ukraine or that was targeting, what was the Midwest pipeline? Sorry, my brain scrolled, I forgot the name. All of that stuff is there and is accessible for your use. So let's see, Grayson dropped us a big, yeah, Colonial Pipeline, that was it, thank you. Important note, threat modeling assumptions, you really don't have to go deep into the OT side to understand the adversary and what they would do. Yeah, he's exactly right. You don't have to get too deep into thinking from an OT perspective if you're trying to threat model and build and make assumptions on who would target you and how they would cause impact. That specific environment, your IT environment, is 9 times out of 10 the way they're going to get in at some form of connected device. So you could threat model this and track this to where they gain that access and make your assumptions from there. Let's see. Cool. Next. So moving on. TTPs. You've heard me say this a million times so far in this, half hour or so we've been running. As we're talking through these, as we're thinking about this, your hows, your whats, and your whys. The way I typically think about this and look at this from a procedural level, from a reporting level, the tactics, these represent that whole strategic goal. This is the why they're doing a thing. Your techniques, the actual like tactical goal, what is that high level representation that they're trying to do? This is the what they're doing, you know? And then the procedures, the behaviors themselves, this is the actual thing they're doing, the how. So our whys, our whats, our hows, these are the things we're thinking about. And a really good quote from Colin Powell was, as an intelligence officer, your responsibility is to tell me what you know, tell me what you don't know, and then you're allowed to tell me what you think. But we always want to keep those three separated. And when we think about this from a CTI perspective, we know, we think they have overall specific tactics or objectives in place, but based on procedures, based on their behaviors, those are things we can truly know. We've seen it. We can say they do the thing. So let's give you a quick example and then we will move on from CTI. Now I know we've harped on this for 4 or 5 slides or so, but that's because this is a very integral part of the process for purple teaming and threat emulation development as a whole. You have to understand where you can find it, what you're trying to plan and build out, and always put it into a manner that's actionable and usable for your team. So for those of you, if you aren't following in chat, there's a lot of good links and stuff being dropped in there for good places for feeds on targeted and actionable intel. I've been seeing some cool stuff floating around in there. But so kind of a good example here when we're thinking about stuff that's like testing capabilities, stuff that's signatural, and stuff that we can actually help emulate. This comes from Destroyer 2. It's just a quick little snippet of how we can combine those things and make it into something we could emulate and build detections against. So in this example within Destroyer, a binary blob was dropped and loaded into memory into this campaign, the pa.pay file. Then there's an executable that's downloaded, decrypted, that actually runs and is used to make pa.pay do something. Then following on from there, we saw, and there was reporting on some of these components for the overall kill chain of Destroyer 2 were being deployed via group policy. And that PowerShell enumeration was being used for that enumeration piece. So we can take all of this together and build out a viable, say, micro emulation or kill chain based on what we've known to see them have done. Now, signaturable files and things like that, that's cool to see if those detections work. But what we really want here is the combination of this behavior, right? They create and write files, they use another executable, they bring tools in, and then they're using stuff that's living off the land. We can take this and we can emulate this and build out our responses to the overall behavior, not just to little bitty pieces that we would build signatures and things around. So thinking about this on an OT side, OT perspective, for initial attack vectors and the way things typically get in and our threat modeling for the OT side, SANS did a cool little study on this. And typically what we usually see is it's coming from internet accessible devices. So whether this is some kind of external remote services, so like remote management, your VPN gateways, public facing applications that were able to be exploited, all the typical compromises you kind of see in IT environments, but also the stuff you would see in that kind of OT environment as well. So like the engineering workstation being compromised, data historians, things that typically live in that layer 2, level 3 area, or even sometimes it could be like, think back to our initial scenario that I started this call with when we were thinking about the vendor getting into the environment, that supply chain compromise. This is something that's very valid and it's something we've seen before, right? So all of this is things we can take into account for how these scenarios feed, how we're building our actual emulation plan. So Eric, this question there, I'll come back to that. Let me get through the slide. I know I'm running close to time on you guys. I'll finish these out and then I'll answer that question, good sir. But yeah, these are anything that's moving outbound. Think of it, not even outbound like to the world. This could be outbound to an internal cloud remote management toolings, things like that. These are giving us that lateral movement and that ability to see and hear. So these are things we can actually build and work around. Some vendors even require you to drop in and allow them to have internet connectivity to their specific parts of the process that they maintain for diagnostics, for updates, things like that. And this is kind of a unique issue you see in the OT space. So threat modeling. Bringing it back to the Purdue model now, everything we talked about with CTI, doing good threat modeling, where to find that information, and now thinking about it from the perspective of a segmented IT/OT process. This is kind of like think of it as a risk-based view of this model. So the traditional enterprise IT, this is typically going to be the way in, whether it's through your actual IT environment or it's through some kind of bypass that was left in place and allowed internet connectivity within that level 2 or below. That kind of bypasses all of your beachheads and things like that. Level 3, those OT systems, this beachhead, this level 2, all of these are going to serve kind of as that entry point to OT and beyond. Typically, this is the only route in, so this is our bottleneck in the way we're going to see and hope that we test and look against. All of these devices in this realm, they know how to talk lower. So these are typically the things from a threat modeling perspective that are going to be targeted. They want to get here. And the biggest reason and the biggest things to think about and why they would want to get here, they no longer have to worry about performing discovery behaviors or actions. These devices already know what's below it. They have explicit listings and instructions for them. They understand how to talk to them. And most important of all, from a threat perspective, they have the permissions and the ability to communicate and issue new commands to those in the process at a lower level. So if I can get to that HMI, if I can get to those engineering workstations, that's kind of a gold mine for you as a threat perspective, right? So these with these in mind, with thinking about what this beachhead, this kind of mix of legacy and modern IT OT environments is doing for us from a threat perspective, is it's also reintroducing old vulnerabilities, old legacy exploits and stuff like that that have been long since shored up in our traditional IT. They'll work in OT. There's a good chance that some of that stuff from 5, 10, 15 years ago might still work in here. Does anybody remember MS 08067, that API? That it predominantly affected what kind of systems? XP, that date range right within there. A lot of those operating systems that are working in these environments are still potentially vulnerable to those old exploits. So what's old is new again when you think about it from an OT perspective and threat modeling. Don't sleep on these things. Don't forget that it's there. Now, doing the actual testing and talking about different stages. When we're doing testing in traditional IT, passive active measures are typically always okay. That's not quite the case when it comes to OT environments. Anything you're passively doing, say listening off of a port, just watching traffic, looking at things that you have direct access to that don't require you to affect change or move or do something, is typically okay in either style environment. From an active perspective, anything that's going to require you making a change, doing things like network scans, introducing new traffic into the environment that might potentially cause a disruption with the lower level process, this is not okay. And these are the typical things that we would avoid. But there's a cool little catch to this, and a thing we can take into account for our threat modeling and the way we run our TTPs and behaviors is OT introduces this cool new little thing called vendor specific tools for their equipment. So they're utilizing those vendor tool sets and the stuff that's provided on those workstations, the HMIs. All of these tools, they understand how to interact with those lower level processes. So we could directly utilize those to perform the actions on objectives. And these is something you would typically see in the production or in the lab. And this is a great place to get to from a threat perspective. Not only are they landing on the host that has access and ability to interact with everything, but all of the tools, all the things they need to affect change are already there. So as you're doing your threat modeling, as you're going about thinking about it for testing and performing the testing, keep this in mind. These are going to be vendor specific. They're going to be more safe than you just trying to come up with your own random protocol stack and just throwing data out into the wild. And we talked about the whole living off the land concept too. And I want to just touch on that one more time real quick. From a traditional ITO perspective, we think about it typically as like law bins and things like that as a Microsoft signed file, either native to the OS or downloaded from Microsoft. So the perfect example of this is using run DLL32 for execution or pulling down something like psexec out of sysinternals, still a valid Microsoft file or executable, right? And a lot of times these things that has been put in place on the operating system from the vendor like Microsoft has always some kind of unintended or interesting functionality that's not documented. And that's a rabbit hole we could go down for another hour, but I won't dive on that. There's the exceptions that we put in place for allow listing on our applications. All of these also provide potential bypasses, and they've got functionality that would be useful to a threat or to a red team from an IT perspective. These same things exist from an ICS perspective or an OT perspective, whether it's the OT vendor's application for interacting with their equipment, it could be native to the device or the ecosystem as a whole or downloaded from the vendor. These things, they have that device specific functionality. They're able to directly interact and they have that functionality that would still be useful for us. So we need to ensure that we're bringing these in, that we're accounting for these as we're building our threat and as we're performing the actual execution. Can your blue team not just see traffic, see traditional operating system logs, just traditional host interactions? Can they also see, understand, and interpret what's going on with these OT and vendor-specific tools and protocols? So that was a quick push through 31 slides or so. And I want to drop us to a quick thought exercise here and for you guys to noodle over as you leave this call today. From a threat perspective and from a defensive perspective, looking at a threat, what kind of insights can we gain from these scopes? So like from a host level, just in the lab, a singular host that was deployed using like your gold disk, all of your security toolings and things were put in place. What insights could you find? What could you validate from here? What about your telemetry? Can you see it? What kind of timing do you have from that host getting hit to you seeing it in your SIEM or whatever it is you're using to hunt from? Your mean time to alert or your mean time to detect and your ability to alert on these things is really critical in a modern day. So we need to keep these things in mind. The same thing can be done adding a server, adding in your jump box and your movement into OT. What are the insights you can get from each stage of these? What part of the threats, kill chain, or process are you able to effectively see and alert on? As you move through all of this, it's providing you a lot of good relevant data that you can test. There's a bunch of different telemetry from each different phase, especially when you think about that jump box or your beachhead area in that realm. There's a lot that can be said for that because a typical threat is going to have to progress through it. So spend time in each one of these different realms and focus on what you're doing as you go through the test. As you're doing this, as you're going through these scenarios, improving from, say, just a singular host to, say, a critical server to that level 3 and to the jump series, you're showing, you're validating what you can do, that you understand safety and security is paramount to OT, and you're building and establishing that trust, which is effectively going to allow you to start pushing further and further to the right with your testing, actually getting to those HMIs, being able to show access, that kind of stuff. It's when it starts getting really fun. So with all this in mind, we'll wrap it up. The tooling and the way you're testing also matters, right? So you're at a Scythe Workshop webinar, so obviously we're going to talk about ourselves a little bit. Our tool combines the ability to directly interact and test threat emulations from an IT perspective as well as OT. We provide that kind of realism because it's going to allow you to actually emulate the behaviors you're seeing, the artifacts, not just running Metasploit and doing a thing. We've got flexibility in the way that you can build and automate your testing. You can choose from what we have curated in our library. You can build your own. You can bring in modules. We've got stuff built to help with a bunch of the capabilities that you're seeing and that you want to emulate. And the key here is also being able to replay it, being able to build and automate and have a curated library is going to allow you to be much more effective. You're going to spend less time developing and more time actually testing and securing. And as we said, especially with OT, when you start thinking about reliability and trustworthiness, that's key, right? So you want a tool that you know is going to work. It's not going to do extra little things. There's no unintended side effects. We've built this tool to be that kind of a tool. It's meant to be safe for you to use, not just in labs, but also in a production environment. We're not going to introduce malware to you. We're not just pulling down code and things like POCs from ExploitDB and chucking it across the C2 channels. That's not happening. So we're really building that in there and establishing that trust and reliability for you. And what I would say is most important to all when we think from a Purple perspective is our ability for collaboration and communication. It gives everyone a high level view, allows them to actually see what's happening, and it gives you a great jumping point to say, hey, here's what we did, here's how it's played out, here's your timestamps, the process IDs, the commands that were run, let's hunt for it. Brings everyone kind of into the fold. Quick example, just using Indestroyer again as an example from our library. We've got blog posts, we've got a bunch of extensive threads created for you guys to peruse through and that you can utilize in these attempts. Just a quick few others that are in the threat library. I know we've harped on Indestroyer a bit because it's a really good example for this webinar, but Indestroyer 2, a lot of the APTs, we've got threat simulated for those. Egregor, Fuller to Water, the actual whole breach campaign is there, Orange Worm, Black Basta. I mean, the list goes on. Having that content library is going to really give you a lot of variety in what you can do and what you can prepare for and against, correct? And I know this was a whirlwind. If this all ran fast for you, if you weren't able to catch part 1, we at Scythe, we've created this thing called the Purple Team Exercise Framework. It's out there for free for you on our GitHub. It's 20 or so pages. It covers the whole PTE process. It provides you with examples, ways that you could find and build CTI, ways you could document, ways to show reporting. We've got examples for all of it. So I would say at a minimum, check it out. This might be something useful for you to start implementing into your Purple Team framework and the way you guys perform execution. Last tips, concerns for you guys. Testing, purple teaming, doing all this with OT, it starts with trust. If you don't develop and build trust, this isn't going anywhere. That transparency keys for you is key. And no matter what, in this order, safety, availability, and revenue. So you need to ensure safety no matter what. Your IT team, your equipment, the way you guys do things, you're protecting OT. You're a layer to their defensive posture. You're a great place to start with these kind of engagements and iterate towards the OT environments. And again, access versus impact. You can show impact or assume impact just by having access. So don't think you have to make a change to the OT side to actually meet the goal of your engagement and of what you're doing. And that is it from me. That is the informational piece of this. From us, we have a swag store. If you really like our cool little shirts and things that we put out there with this awesome unicorn on it, any revenue or stuff that comes through the proceeds from our swag store goes to help save chubby unicorns. It's given to a wildlife conservation fund. So go check it out. And that is me. These slides, if wanted, can be shared after the fact. There's some more resources and things in the notes that you guys can take back with you. Let me take a minute. I know I ran over time. Let me see what questions popped up in here since I tried to move forward faster. Can you do TTPs against non-ICS machines? I cover DoD and government would love products such as a Tyke IQ plus Scythe. So Eric, when you're asking, can you do TTPs against non-ICS machines? Are you asking like, is our tooling functional within traditional IT? Yes, our tooling works with the payload, the modules, the threads that we're building and curating. Everything works with traditional Windows environments. It works with Linux hosts. It works with Mac OS, and you can utilize it within that OT perspective. Jim was saying Industry 4.0 in Italy is a nightmare, is that they want everything to have remote access. And to me, that's kind of astounding. Like, I'm flabbergasted that you would want remote access to the world, to processes that are controlling, say, power, water, things like that for an entire region or a country. That's painful, and I'm sure that's hard to deal with. Sorry about that. Yeah, if you want to drop your LinkedIn stuff in chat, go ahead. Doesn't bother me at all. So that is the end of what I have to say. I will stick around for a second if you guys have any other questions, comments, concerns. Thanks for the interaction in chat, by the way. It's really hard at times to do workshops and webinars and just talk to a camera and not know what's going on. So anything you guys put in chat and the direct interaction helps us as the presenters. Cool. Thanks for attending, guys. I'm going to kill the session here in a minute then. If there's no other questions, catch us on our next one. We've got a bunch more stuff coming up. We've got a detection engineering workshop. This one is actually a workshop, not just a webinar, so you'll have a chance to get hands-on coming at the end of the month. I believe that's on the 26th. In April, there's one on actual threat emulation engineering, building out the threats, not just thinking of it from a holistic purple perspective. It's also hands-on. If you guys want to check those out and learn something cool or new, come and visit. Oh yeah, great actual ad there, Yanni. Unicon 2024, it is April 9th, all day. It is a free online conference you can attend. It's got some really awesome speakers. So Leslie Carhart, Dave Kennedy, our CEO, Bryson himself, a bunch of people from the outside world are doing some awesome talks regarded to anything IT, security, purple teaming. It's going to be really fun, really cool. A lot of good people to hear from. And it's free. Did I mention free? So go check it out, register, and we will see you guys there.